We drove home from dinner, our minds racing. Was it time to stay or time to go? We had just come to the world-altering decision that it was time to leave the place we had lived for the last 10 years. By now, you've heard my Jesus story, where I asked the question, can God be trusted? After a season of pain, I didn't know if God was good and worth following. It was a literal, undeniable experience of his presence that convinced me to follow God. And you've heard my call story, where I asked the question, if I'm a woman, can I be a pastor? I grew up in conservative evangelicalism, and my life felt directionless until I was ready to hear God's call on my life to become a pastor. Now, if you didn't hear those stories, they are on YouTube. Randy, our videographer, did an amazing job filming and editing them. They're worth your time to go watch them. And today the question is, how did I wind up here in Lansing? But really, the question underneath that is, should we stay or should we leave? Can we risk leaving everything we've ever known for the hope of something better? I grew up in a small town outside of Raleigh, North Carolina. I was born in Raleigh and I lived in the area until I graduated high school. I went to college at East Carolina University in Greenville, North Carolina. Lots of people hear those facts about me and wonder that I don't have a strong Southern accent. Well, it will come out in certain times and in certain words and places. But the real answer to that question is that my parents are from the Northeast. They're from Long Island, New York, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. They moved to North Carolina before they started a family, and I was homeschooled until 5th grade. So those early years when I was learning to talk were mostly spent at home. This is also the reason that I love to watch hockey. My dad was a huge hockey fan, and we got a unique opportunity to experience hockey when the Hartford Whalers moved their franchise from Connecticut to Raleigh, and they became the Hurricanes in 1997. And even though our family didn't have a lot of extra financial resources, we were able to attend some of those games as the team was getting established, and the tickets were dirt cheap. Now, if you've been following along, you might wonder what my parents think about me as a pastor, and the answer is that they are huge cheerleaders of mine. Now, I mentioned last week that I had been working as a baker in a restaurant in the years before I heard God's call on my life to become a pastor. I was out of work for almost 8 months between leaving that job and then being offered a job at the United Methodist Church we were attending. This was a church we came to because they were active in missions, both internationally and locally. We developed a connection with the outreach director at that church. He directed the local and international missions. Now, I forget how we first met him, but Anton lived right around the corner from us. He was South African and often felt the stress of living cross-culturally. He was single and often came over to our house after our kids were in bed. And we just talked theology and missions and generally just hang out. Now, he launched a monthly magazine to share with the church the opportunities that his team was creating for people to get involved in missions. And early on, that team invited me to write a monthly feature. It was a book review on a book that was related to that month's topic. And then a few months later, they invited me to join the team as the editor of that magazine. I also handled a lot of the team's communication with missionaries and through prayer lists and social media updates. I really enjoyed building a team of writers, caring for missionaries, and facilitating the short-term missions training days. We planned around 10 to 15 trips a year. This was a really great way for me to develop as a communicator. I wrestled with questions like, what should our response be to the persecution of the global church? What is the sort of biblical reason that we chose to partner with these specific organizations? How should we approach outreach in our city? And then about halfway through my time in seminary, the church leadership invited me to consider moving to a different part-time position. So they knew that my calling was to pastoral ministry kind of generally. And they had some staffing needs related to pastoral care and small groups. So I agreed that that would be a great fit. And in that space, I was able to begin assisting with funerals and weddings. I also got the opportunity to preach at weekend services a couple of times. And then in December of 2019, our lead pastor initiated a conversation with me. He knew that I would be graduating in May of 2020, and he wanted to know if I would be interested in a full-time position. He couldn't guarantee that one would be available, but he wanted to gauge my interest before he began to do the work of putting that full-time position together. In an effort to manage my expectations, he also let me know that my opportunities to preach, something that I loved doing and considered a core part of my calling, would remain about the same. And at that time, it was about once a year. My initial reaction was that yes, I would be interested in that. After all, I needed time to prove myself and work up to more responsibilities and more teaching opportunities, right? Maybe I could scratch the itch that I had to preach and teach through a small group gathering that had a sort of small message, but revolved around receiving communion together. And then one weekend soon after that, my parents offered to keep our kids for the night. They were about an hour and 15 minutes away from us. They had gotten tickets to a park in Raleigh that turned their train into the Polar Express during the holiday season. And as Nathan and I drove back to Greenville after dropping them off, we talked. Should I stay and keep trying to make something work here? I had been honestly kind of frustrated by the lack of opportunities. I felt like I had some leadership gifts and passion, but felt like I was being kept at arm's length for various reasons. Maybe I should consider something else. At the time, Nathan was the executive director of a small Christian nonprofit in Greenville. It was a place called 3rd Street Education Center. Leaving would be a big deal. And we had family, the friends family group we called Open Table. Many of them would babysit our kids for free. Our boys had gotten connected to an after-school and summer camp program designed specifically for kids with their diagnosis that ran for free. Leaving would be a big deal. I had never lived outside of Eastern North Carolina. It was all I ever knew. And my parents were just over an hour away, willing to keep the kids and help out when we needed it. Leaving would be a big deal. We had been in Greenville for almost 11 years. All 3 of our kids were born at that local hospital. This was the only home they ever knew. Leaving would be a really big deal. What if I saw ordination through the United Methodist Church and got an appointment at a small church in the rural towns around Greenville? It seemed like the UMC was on the verge of a split. I wasn't really comfortable with how the conservative side of the split talked about the other side, but I wasn't quite ready to join the liberal side. I had grown up in conservative evangelicalism, and I inherited their perspectives on sexuality and gender. I was spending nearly all of my mental and emotional energy showing up as a woman in ministry in the South, where many people thought it was suspicious that I wanted to do anything in my life other than stay home with my kids. And I was trying to start conversations around and work toward racial justice, where many people were antagonistic to that work. I just didn't have the bandwidth to read and study passages in the Bible related to sexuality. So I didn't challenge the conservative side, except to say that the way they talked about this felt so similar to the conversation that I grew up hearing about women in ministry. How those people didn't take the Bible seriously, how they were being swayed by the culture. But at the end of the day, I thought that getting involved in a small rural United Methodist church would allow me to get some experience leading. I could preach regularly, like we wouldn't have to move. Nathan could stay at his job. The kids would have their support. We'd still have family nearby. This could work. And then Nathan said something I'll never forget. He said, "I think my time at 3rd Street is coming to an end." All of a sudden, the possibilities seemed endless and overwhelming. If his job wasn't keeping us here, maybe we really could consider a big move. Should we stay in the South? Should we go to a city? Should we stay rural? Where could we thrive? Did such a place even exist? And then we went to dinner and we just talked through it all. And we came to the conclusion that we would move. We weren't sure where, but the more we talked, the more moving out of state sounded appealing. What if we even moved out of the South and I didn't have to justify my presence in ministry in every work conversation? I remember after dinner, we walked to an eggnog pop-up place. Yes, this was an eggnog pop-up place. It was a seasonal restaurant that sold specialty homemade eggnogs, some spiked, some flavored. It was amazing. And since we didn't have the kids with us, we just wanted to enjoy our time. We ran into some friends from church, and the news felt so big in our minds, and yet we definitely couldn't say anything. It felt like those early days of pregnancy when your whole world has changed, but you're not ready to say anything to anyone else yet. So you're talking to someone on the outside, you're trying to just be like normal, but on the inside, your brain has a neon light blinking. Pregnant, pregnant, pregnant. Except our brains were blinking, moving, moving, moving. We had just come to the life-altering decision that it was time to leave the place we had lived for the last 10 years. This was a really big deal.